Everyone in Harlan County knew the dead orchard on Raven Cliff. It was visible from the valley floor, a cluster of skeletal trees standing on the cliff's edge like the bones of a hand reaching out of the rock. Leafless, gray, silhouetted against the sky in a way that made children stare and old women cross themselves. There were maybe 40 trees up there, planted in rows that were still visible despite decades of neglect, their trunks twisted by wind and their branches stripped bare by ice storms, and their bark split open in long vertical wounds that showed the pale wood underneath like exposed ribs. They had been apple trees once. A man named Bowen Sark, my grandfather, had planted them in 1911, the year he came back from the war in the Philippines with a bag of seeds, a bad leg, and an idea that an apple orchard on the highest point in the county would produce fruit so good the whole state would know his name. He cleared 3 acres on the clifftop, hauled soil up the mountain in baskets, planted 40 Albemarle Pippin seedlings, a variety he swore was the finest apple in Virginia, and waited. The trees grew. For 15 years, they grew. The photographs I found later showed them in their prime, heavy with fruit, their canopies touching, the orchard a green crown on the gray cliff. My grandfather sold apples in the valley below. He won a ribbon at the county fair in 1924. He was, for a brief and beautiful period, exactly who he wanted to be. A man who grew something extraordinary in an impossible place. Then the blight came. In 1927, a fungal disease swept through the orchards of southwestern Virginia, killing apple trees by the thousands. It hit the clifftop orchard harder than anywhere else. The elevation, the exposure, the thin soil all made the trees vulnerable. By 1929, every tree on Raven Cliff was dead. Or so everyone believed. The leaves fell and didn't return. The bark cracked and peeled. The branches went brittle and broke in the winter storms. My grandfather stopped climbing the cliff. He moved to a cabin at the base of the mountain, took work in the mines, and never spoke about the orchard again. He died in the spring of 1941, alone in his cabin at the base of the mountain, and he left the cliff to me, his granddaughter, Lark Sark, age 16, currently residing at the Wise County Home for Girls after the death of my mother from black lung complications. She had breathed the coal dust from my father's clothes for 15 years, and it killed her the same way it killed the miners. And the departure of my father to wherever it is that men go when they can't face what they've become. The matron at the home, a woman named Mrs. Blankenship, told me I had inherited 3 acres of dead wood on a rock. The girls in the dormitory called it the Bone Orchard. The county assessor valued it at $2, one for the land, one for the firewood. If you want to find out what those dead trees had been doing for 14 years, while everyone thought they were gone, and what their roots had broken through to, deep in the cliff, that changed everything we knew about that mountain. Subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because those trees weren't dead, they were waiting, and what they found underground was worth more than any apple ever grown. I climbed Raven Cliff on a Wednesday morning in April, carrying everything I owned in a flour sack. The trail was steep, 1,000 feet of elevation in less than a mile, switchbacking through oak and hickory forest before breaking out onto the exposed clifftop, where the wind hit you like an open hand. The cliff faced west, overlooking the valley, and on a clear day, you could see the Cumberland Gap in the distance, a notch in the mountains where Daniel Boone had walked through 2 centuries ago into the wilderness beyond. The orchard was exactly as terrible as everyone said. 40 trees standing in crooked rows, their trunks gray and cracked, their branches bare, their bark hanging in strips like old skin. The soil between the rows was thin and rocky. Whatever my grandfather had hauled up here had washed away in the decades since he'd stopped tending it. Wind-stunted grass and moss grew in patches. A few determined wildflowers, columbine and fire pink, clung to crevices in the limestone. The only sound was the wind and the creak of dead branches rubbing against each other, like dry bones. My grandfather's cabin was at the orchard's eastern edge, where a natural shelf of rock provided some wind protection. It was small, one room, stone fireplace, plank floor, but built with the stubbornness of a man who intended to stay. The roof was tin and still tight. The fireplace drew well. The door closed and latched. It was, by the standards of the mountain, livable. I dropped my flour sack on the floor and went to look at the trees. The first week was survival, not discovery. The cliff top was exposed to every weather the mountains could throw. Wind that never stopped, rain that came sideways, morning frost, well into April. I had almost no food. The few canned goods in my grandfather's cabin were a decade old. The labels rusted off, the contents a gamble between sustenance and sickness. I ate what the mountain offered. Ramps that grew in the sheltered spots below the cliff, dandelion greens, a handful of wild onions, fiddlehead ferns I found in a seep spring at the mountain's base. I made the 2-hour round trip to that spring every morning for water, hauling it up the cliff in a bucket that grew heavier with every switchback. But the trees pulled at me. Even in those first desperate days of hunger and cold, I found myself walking among them, touching their trunks, studying their bark, trying to understand how something could look so dead and yet feel so present. There was a quality to the orchard that I couldn't name. Not silence exactly, but a kind of waiting, as if the trees were holding their breath. I don't know why I touched the first one the way I did. Curiosity, maybe. Or grief. The kind of grief you feel for something you never knew but recognize as yours. I put my hand on the trunk of the nearest tree, a thick old pippin at the end of the first row, and I felt something that made me pull my hand back and then put it back again, pressing harder. The trunk was warm. Not sun-warm. The day was overcast and cool. Warm from inside. A faint, steady warmth radiating from the heartwood through the split bark, as if something deep in the tree was still alive, still metabolizing, still generating the heat that living cells produce. I pressed my ear to the trunk, and I heard it, so faint I thought at first it was my own pulse. A slow, rhythmic creaking. Not the dead creak of branches in the wind. Something deeper. Something that came from below, from the roots, from the place where the tree met the stone. The trees on Raven Cliff were not dead. They were dormant. And whatever they were connected to underground was keeping them alive. It took me 2 weeks to understand what I was seeing, and it took my grandfather's journal to explain it. I found the journal on the 3rd day, in a tin box nailed to the underside of the cabin's sleeping shelf, hidden deliberately where a casual visitor wouldn't find it. It was a small book, maybe 100 pages, and the first half was what you'd expect. Planting records, growth measurements, harvest notes, the proud documentation of a man watching his dream take root. The ribbon at the county fair. The best year, 1924, when the orchard produced 300 bushels of Albemarle pippins that he sold for more money than he'd ever seen. Then the blight entries. Clinical at first, then desperate, then silent. The last entry about the trees was dated November 1929. All 40 gone, leaves dropped, bark splitting, No sign of recovery. 20 years of work. Done. But the journal didn't end there. There were more entries. Sporadic, written over the next 12 years. As if my grandfather kept coming back to the book the way you keep touching a wound to see if it still hurts. The entry, dated March 1933, stopped my breath. Went up to the cliff today. First time in 2 years. Something wrong with the trees. Not more dead. Different. The bark has split further, but underneath the wood is not dry. It's moist. Green in places. The big pippin at the end of row 1 is warm to the touch. I put my ear to it and heard something, like water moving, deep down. The roots of these trees go into the cliff rock. I always knew that. I thought they were anchoring. What if they're feeding? And then, June 1935, dug around the base of the big pippin. The roots go straight down through a crack in the limestone. Followed one root as far as I could, maybe 4 feet into the rock. It's growing. The root is alive and growing into the cliff. The tree above is dead, but the tree below is alive. Where are the roots going? What are they finding? And his final entry, February 1941, a month before he died. I'm too old and too sick to climb that cliff anymore, but I know what's under those trees. The roots have found something. A mineral seam, a water source, something in the deep rock that's keeping them alive from below. The trees look dead because all their energy has gone underground. They're not dying. They're transforming. If someone younger came along, someone strong enough to dig, patient enough to understand, they could find out what the roots have found. And I believe it would be extraordinary. He had known. For years he had known his trees were alive, and he had been too broken and too old to follow them into the rock. He had left the journal for someone to find. He had left it for me. I started digging the next morning. The big pippin at the end of row 1, the one my grandfather had written about, was the largest tree in the orchard, its trunk nearly 2 feet across. The bark was cracked open in a long fissure that ran from the base to about 6 feet up, and inside the fissure, just as my grandfather had described, the wood was moist. Not just moist, faintly green, with a thin layer of living cambium beneath the dead outer bark. The tree was alive in its core, drawing sustenance from below, maintaining a minimal metabolism that kept the heartwood from truly dying. I pressed my palm flat against the exposed cambium and felt that warmth again, faint but real, the warmth of cells working, of life persisting in a place where life had been declared over. At the base of the trunk, 3 massive roots plunged into the limestone. They didn't spread outward the way apple tree roots normally do, radiating in a wide, shallow network to capture surface water. These roots went straight down, following fractures in the cliff rock, diving into the mountain with a directness that was almost aggressive. They had found the cracks, and they had followed them, and they had kept going, year after year, pushing deeper, while the canopy above withered, and everyone assumed the trees were dead. I dug around the largest root with my grandfather's pickaxe. The limestone was hard but fractured. The same karst geology that ran through all of southwestern Virginia, riddled with cracks and cavities carved by ancient water. The root had exploited every fracture, sending tendrils of living tissue into gaps sometimes no wider than a pencil. I followed it down 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet. The root thickened as it descended, which was wrong. Roots are supposed to get thinner as they branch. This root was getting fatter, as if it were storing something it was absorbing from the rock. At 5 feet, I hit a cavity. The pickaxe broke through into a space beneath the limestone, a pocket, roughly 3 feet across, where the rock had dissolved away over millennia, and inside that pocket, the root had done something I had never seen in any book, any diagram, any description of how trees work. It had formed a bulb, a massive, swollen knot of root tissue the size of a watermelon, pale and dense, wrapped around a seam of mineral-rich clay that ran through the cavity like a vein of ore. The root had found this clay, saturated with moisture and rich with iron, calcium, phosphorus, and trace minerals leached from the limestone over millions of years, and had essentially built a storage organ around it, a living cistern, an underground pantry that the tree had created for itself when the surface could no longer support it. I cut a small piece of the root bulb and tasted it. It was intensely bitter, astringent, with a minerality that made my teeth tingle. It tasted like the earth itself, concentrated, ancient, powerful. And I thought, if the root is storing these minerals, what would happen to the tree if I helped it use them? What would happen if I pruned the dead wood, opened the bark, let light reach the living cambium, and coaxed these trees, these extraordinary, stubborn, impossible trees, back to the surface? The first person who helped me understand was Doc Amelia Price. Doc Price was not a medical doctor. She was a plant pathologist, a scientist who studied tree diseases at Virginia Polytechnic Institute, 60 miles away in Blacksburg. I learned about her from a pamphlet at the county extension office, and I wrote her a letter describing what I'd found. Apple trees that appeared dead for 14 years, but were alive underground, with roots that had penetrated limestone and formed storage bulbs around mineral deposits. She arrived 3 weeks later in a university truck, accompanied by a graduate student named Paul, who carried her equipment and said almost nothing. Doc Price was 53, small, sharp-eyed, with dirt permanently embedded under her fingernails and an energy that made the mountain air feel slow. She spent 2 days examining the trees. She took core samples from 6 trunks and found living tissue in every one. She excavated a second root system and found another bulb, smaller than the first, but the same structure, wrapped around the same mineral clay. She tested the clay and the root tissue and the wood and the soil, and on the evening of the second day, sitting on my grandfather's porch with a cup of coffee and a look on her face that I would later learn meant she had discovered something that would define her career. She told me what was happening. These trees did something that we've theorized about, but never documented in the field, she said. When the blight killed the canopy, the root systems didn't die. They redirected. All the energy that would normally go into leaves and fruit went underground instead. The roots grew deeper, found the mineral seam, and essentially hibernated around it. They've been drawing nutrients from that clay for 14 years, storing them in these bulb structures, waiting. Waiting for what? For conditions to change, for the blight to pass, for someone to help them come back. She looked at me. These trees want to grow, Lark. They've been preparing for it for 14 years. The root systems are enormous, far larger than any surface orchard would produce, and they're loaded with minerals that most apple trees never access because their roots don't go deep enough. If you can revive the canopy, prune the dead wood, protect the living cambium, nurse them through one growing season, I believe these trees will produce fruit unlike anything you've ever seen. Because of the minerals? Because of everything. The depth of the roots, the mineral content, the 14 years of stored energy. These trees have been charging like batteries in the dark. When they finally put out leaves and fruit, it's going to be extraordinary. I spent the summer of 1941 pruning. 40 trees. Every one of them needed the dead wood removed, carefully, strategically, opening the canopy to light without damaging the living tissue beneath. Doc Price sent detailed instructions by mail. Paul, the graduate student, came up twice to check my work. And I climbed every tree with my grandfather's pruning saw, and I cut away what was dead, and I sealed the wounds with beeswax and pine tar, and I talked to the trees while I worked. Because my grandfather's journal said he always talked to them. And because it felt right, and because nobody was listening anyway, by August, something was happening. Small, pale green shoots were emerging from the sealed wounds. Not many, not strong, but alive. Leaves. Tiny, curled, tentative leaves pushing out of wood that hadn't produced foliage in 14 years. The trees were waking up. The first person besides Doc Price to see the green was old Tolliver Husk, a beekeeper who kept hives on the mountain below the cliff. He climbed up one September morning to check on a wayward swarm and found me sitting among the trees, which now had a faint green haze across their branches, sparse, fragile, but unmistakably present. "Lord God," Tolliver whispered, staring at the orchard. "They're alive." "They were always alive," I said, "just underground." Tolliver became my ally, the way old mountain men become allies, without announcement, without discussion, simply by showing up the next morning with tools and saying, "What do you need?" He brought his bees to the cliff the following spring, setting 6 hives along the orchard's edge because apple trees need pollination, and pollination needs bees. And without Tolliver's bees, my trees could have bloomed for a decade without setting a single fruit. He brought me honey and beeswax for sealing pruning wounds. He brought lumber for repairing the cabin. He brought his wife's biscuits, which kept me fed on the days I was too busy with the trees to cook. And he brought news to the valley that the bone orchard was turning green, which people didn't believe until they climbed the cliff and saw it themselves. The first full bloom came in the spring of 1943. It was not dramatic. No explosion of white blossoms like a healthy orchard produces. It was modest, scattered, a tree here and a tree there, putting out clusters of pale pink flowers that the bees found immediately and worked with a frenzy that Tolliver said he'd never seen. "They know," he said, watching his bees swarm the blossoms. "The bees can smell it. Something in those flowers is different." He was right. The mineral content that the roots had been absorbing for 14 years was now flowing upward into the reviving canopy, and the flowers, and later the fruit, carried that mineral signature. When the first apples formed in late summer, small and few but real, flushed with gold and a blush of red that deepened as September came, I picked one from the big pippin and bit into it and stood on the edge of the cliff with the valley spread below me and the mountains blue in the distance, and I tasted something I will never forget. It was an apple, yes, an Albemarle pippin, the variety my grandfather had planted 30 years ago. But it was more than any pippin I'd ever tasted or would ever taste again. The flesh was dense and crisp. The juice was sweet tart with a depth of flavor that seemed to have layers, a bright fruity top note, then a middle register of something almost savory, then a finish that was mineral and lingering, like tasting the mountain itself. The 14 years of stored nutrients had concentrated in the fruit, producing an apple of extraordinary complexity and intensity. I brought 6 apples to the valley. I gave one to the shopkeeper, Mr. Ratliff, who had called my inheritance dead wood. He bit into it and chewed slowly, and his eyes changed. "What is that?" he said. "That's not a regular apple." "It's a Raven Cliff apple," I said. "It's what happens when a tree spends 14 years drinking from the heart of a mountain." By the following year, every tree in the orchard was producing, not heavily, The recovery was gradual, the trees still rebuilding their canopies. But enough. And the quality was staggering. Doc Price brought colleagues from the university to test the fruit, and their analysis confirmed what my tongue had told me. The mineral content of the Raven Cliff apples was 3 to 4 times higher than standard pippins, with elevated levels of iron, calcium, and trace elements that gave the fruit both its extraordinary flavor and significant nutritional value. Word spread. A cider maker in Abingdon named Henry Lowell tasted the apples and drove to the cliff the next day with a contract and a checkbook. He offered me more money per bushel than any apple grower in the state was getting. The cider he made from the first pressing, he called it Raven Cliff Reserve, was dark gold with an aroma that filled a room and a flavor so layered and complex that a sommelier in Richmond compared it to a Burgundy wine. A chef in Roanoke drove 2 hours to buy a case and called them the most remarkable apples in Virginia. The county extension agent wrote a bulletin about the orchard that was picked up by the State Agricultural Review. Newspapers sent reporters. Photographers came to capture the orchard that had come back from the dead, the twisted trunks, the gnarled branches, the improbable fruit hanging heavy from wood that had been bare for 14 years. And suddenly, people who had laughed at the bone orchard were reading about it over their morning coffee and shaking their heads, not in mockery anymore, but in the slow, humbled recognition that they had been wrong about something, and wrong in a way that mattered. I married in 1946. His name was Ansel Combs, a returning soldier who had grown up in the valley and who remembered the dead orchard from his childhood and couldn't believe it when he climbed the cliff on a September afternoon and found it alive, green and heavy with fruit, the branches bowing under the weight of apples that glowed gold and red in the autumn light. "This isn't possible," he said, standing in the orchard, holding an apple in each hand. "It is if you're patient enough," I said, "and stubborn enough, and willing to dig." Ansel understood the cliff the way miners understand mountains, from the inside. He helped me excavate more of the root system, discovering that the mineral clay seam ran the entire length of the cliff beneath the orchard, a vein of concentrated nutrients that the 40 trees were tapping through root bulbs that grew larger every year. He built stone terraces around the trees to hold soil and moisture. He expanded the cabin, and he helped me plant a second generation. New seedlings grafted from the original trees, planted in the same fractured limestone, their roots already seeking the deep clay. Tolliver died in 1950 at 78. I buried him at the cliff's edge where his bees could still find him, and I planted a pippin seedling on his grave. My children, we had 3, grew up climbing the same trees I had pruned back from death, eating apples that tasted like the mountain's own blood, running between the rows of an orchard that nobody had believed could exist. Doc Price published her research in 1952, a paper titled Deep Root Mineral Absorption and Dormancy Recovery in Malus Domestica, that became one of the most cited studies in pomological science. She credited my grandfather for planting the orchard and me for reviving it, and she named the phenomenon sark dormancy, the ability of certain deep-rooted trees to survive canopy death by redirecting resources underground. By the 1960s, Raven Cliff apples were famous across Virginia. We produced maybe 200 bushels a year. Never more, the clifftop couldn't support a larger operation. But each bushel was worth 10 times what valley apples brought. The cider alone, pressed from fruit so mineral-rich it fermented with a complexity that cider makers compared to fine wine, won awards at competitions from Virginia to Vermont. Ansel died in 1978, on the cliff, in October, sitting under the big pippin at the end of row 1, the first tree I'd touched, the one whose warmth had told me the orchard was alive. I buried him beside Tolliver, in the orchard, in the soil my grandfather had carried up the mountain in baskets 70 years before. I kept tending. My hands knew every tree, every wound I'd sealed, every branch I'd pruned, every graft I'd set. The orchard was 67 years old by then. The original plantings, and the trees that had nearly died, had grown into the most magnificent specimens I'd ever seen. Their trunks thick and gnarled, their canopies broad and full, their roots reaching so deep into the mountain that I sometimes thought I could feel the whole cliff humming beneath my feet. I died in the spring of 1985, at 60. They found me in the orchard at dawn, sitting against the big pippin with my pruning saw in my lap and the first blossoms of the season opening above me, pale pink against the blue sky, the bees already arriving from Tolliver's hives that my son now tended, the mountain already warm with the promise of another harvest. My daughter said I looked like I was resting between tasks. My son said I looked like I'd finally become part of the tree, rooted, patient, alive in ways that the surface couldn't show. The orchard is still producing. My grandchildren tend it now, 40 original trees and 60 new ones, all drawing from the same deep mineral seam, all producing fruit that tastes like no other apple on earth. Doc Price's Sark dormancy research has been applied to reforestation projects worldwide, proving that trees written off as dead can sometimes be revived if their root systems have found sustenance below. On the trunk of the big pippin, carved into the bark where it has healed over and become part of the tree itself, are 2 lines: Bow and Sark planted. Lark Sark listened. The roots knew the way. So let me ask you something. What in your life looks dead but might just be dormant? What dream? What skill? What piece of yourself did you give up on years ago? Stopped watering? Stopped believing in? Walked away from? That might still be alive underground. Its roots digging deeper than you ever imagined. Finding nourishment in places you never thought to look. Because here's what the orchard taught me. Death and dormancy look exactly the same from the surface. A dead tree and a sleeping tree are indistinguishable to anyone who doesn't press their hand to the trunk and feel for warmth. The world looked at my orchard and saw bones. I touched the bark and felt a heartbeat. Most people don't touch. Most people take the surface at face value, the bare branches, the cracked bark, the $2 assessment, and walk away. They don't dig. They don't listen. They don't consider the possibility that what looks like failure might be transformation, that what looks like death might be the deepest kind of preparation for a life nobody has imagined yet. Your dead thing might not be dead. Press your hand to it. Feel for warmth. Listen for the sound of roots breaking through stone. And if you feel it, that faint, impossible pulse of something still alive, don't walk away. Dig. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the orchards in your life that you've written off too soon, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who found life in the last place anyone expected. Your roots are deeper than you know. They've been working while you slept. Trust them.